That coveted last speaking slot at a conference where anybody who's left is either checking their phones, figuring out what time they need to leave for the airport, or looking at the slides going, oh dear God, not one more PowerPoint presentation. Well, if you do need to leave and catch a flight, you will not offend me whatsoever. Speaking as someone who literally had to throw themselves through the boarding door to make their flight out here, I don't want anyone to be late for their flight. With regards to the PowerPoint presentation, I can't help you very much. It is a PowerPoint presentation, but we'll try to keep it high level, we'll try to keep it fun, and most importantly, we'll try to keep it quick. All right, so again, the main purpose of my presentation today is to talk specifically about a feature in Aurora called the additional plans option and how that can be used within integrated resource planning and long-term capacity expansion. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on my company's background, as well as our most recent IRP, which was filed in June of 2018, because as Ben mentioned, it was actually extremely transformative and it's caused a lot of change within our company, both with our current work and definitely with the work we're going to do moving forward. In addition to that, also want to make a note of the fact that consumers may be in a somewhat unique position at this conference, at least based on who I've talked to this week. We actually are just still in the process of finalizing our transition to Aurora. We had been using the Strategist ABB model. So Aurora was installed at the end of 2018 for our company. We are using it now for zonal and production runs, but we're still kind of just wrapping up the data sets and doing some training and testing for long-term capacity expansion with the expectation that we will be using Aurora for our next integrated resource plan, which will be filed in June of 2021, but we'll start modeling for in January of 2020. And then we'll spend some time going into the actual additional plans option, specifically the different evaluation factors and how we use that option to make better decisions in our modeling and in our integrated resource planning. So a little bit of background on Consumers Energy. We are Michigan's second largest combination utility behind DTE Electric. We have a service territory of 1.8 million customers, and we pretty much serve the entire lower peninsula of Michigan. Now, for those of you who have never met anyone from Michigan or not traveled to Michigan, fun little tip. Us people from Michigan like to say where we're from or located by using our hands. So this is Michigan. So Consumers Energy services the entire lower peninsula of Michigan. So next time you're in Michigan, use your hands to say where you are and everyone will know exactly what you mean. You can see some of our energy numbers here. As has been mentioned, I think, or touched upon previous presentations, we do model within the MISO system. The areas we model would include MISO North, MISO South, Consumers Energy, DTE, and then we have a small area that we kind of group together as the rest of Michigan, which includes METSI and ITC. All right, so as I mentioned, Consumers Energy filed its first ever integrated resource plan in June of 2018. Not only was it Consumers' first ever integrated resource plan, it was actually the first ever integrated resource plan filed in the state of Michigan. So as Lumi mentioned earlier this morning, energy legislation passed in 2016 brought Michigan into the fold in terms of requirements around filing IRPs, and Consumers was basically first on the docket. So we were the first to file. In our IRP, just for a little bit of quick background, we actually analyzed under 3 different scenarios or 3 different worlds per se. First was business as usual, where everything kind of continues as it is now, relatively linear and flat demand growth, relatively linear and flat fuel price growth, both for coal and gas. Again, business as usual. We also analyzed a world called emerging technologies, where there was significant capital cost reductions that could be found for renewables, batteries, and demand-side management programs. That was a very interesting one because honestly, those 30% capital cost reductions and efficiencies are coming more and more true. But again, we were modeling this as early as 2017, so it really was a little bit more emerging at that point. And finally, we analyzed a world or scenario called environmental policy, which called for stringent carbon regulations, actually required a 30% carbon reduction by 2030. So it actually allowed us to model under a carbon price and some specific carbon requirements. Within those 3 different worlds, we were testing a variety of different sensitivities, there we go, based off of fluctuations in demand, fluctuations in capacity price, fluctuations in fuel prices, and a variety of different other things, so that we actually ended up running 224 different cases for our IRP. And that 224 number is important because I'm going to add the number 500 to it in the next slide. So it's a lot of data, and we'll kind of go over again why we generated that much data and then how we actually use that data to make what we believe is a proposed course of action that is the best IRP for Michigan, but is extremely transformative. Anybody who's read the slide can see Consumers Energy is proposing 5 gigawatts of solar by 2030. That actually grows to 6 gigawatts by 2040. We are retiring 2 of our coal units almost a decade early. And we have significant expansions in our demand side programs, as well as in energy storage. And we'll be continuing to look at those different expansions and exactly how those will be installed as we move forward. So a quick note, we filed our IRP in June of 2018. In June of 2019, I'm happy to report that we actually reached a formal signed settlement agreement between Consumers Energy and the majority of our 22 different intervening parties. So actually, as soon as that IRP was filed, we were working with the commission, we were working with our intervening parties, and we actually were able to come to a formally signed settlement agreement that was approved by the commission in June and basically approves our proposed course of action as designed. So this picture is basically the IRP team after that settlement agreement was announced. Yay! So not really, but that's basically how everyone felt. This was a huge win for the company. It was a huge win for, honestly, the commission and our intervening parties as well. We really do try to build that relationship that Lumi talked about with our regulators a couple of presentations ago. That was extremely important in getting to this point. But again, at the end of the day, we really do believe that this is the best IRP for Michigan. That is the statement we project. And this settlement agreement, I think, really helps reinforce that. All right, so that's enough background. So how did we actually get there? So what you're looking at right now is a pretty standard representation of, how the sausage gets made when it comes to long-term capacity expansion and IRP modeling. You take your future scenarios, whatever those may be, the key assumptions you may have around load, fuel, et cetera, what different demand and supply options you're going to use in that integrated resource plan. All goes into your model, and your model spits out some results. So again, to date, up until our transition, Strategist was our sausage-making machine. Interestingly, I showed this slide to one of our other analysts, and she thought that was a toilet, not a... So depending on your frustration level with your model or your stress level in your IRP, that may actually be a better representation of this slide. And then your model, in our case, again, in our 2018 IRP, we did actually model with Strategist. We had signed on with Aurora, but we weren't able to complete the transition before our filing requirements came about. And then those results then have to be pushed through a filter to try to figure out what your resource plan is going to be. Those filter considerations is where we'll spend a lot of our remaining time. So when we use Strategist, Strategist has the same option as Aurora when it comes to additional plans. It's just called optimals and suboptimals. So moving forward, if I kind of interchange the words additional plans with optimals and suboptimals, it's really the same thing. Basically, what Strategist as well as Aurora does is it can generate not only one optimized plan, one plan that meets the constraints, meets the requirements for your study period, but it can generate additional plans that, again, may be additional cost to your portfolio, but can generate additional plans with different resource choices, different yearly choices. And for every single one of those 224 cases that I mentioned earlier, we generated 500 optimized plans with Strategist. So that's, again, a huge amount of data. Now, we're actually excited for the fact that with our transition to Aurora, we're still going to get that option. In fact, it's even a little bit more customized. Aurora does offer this same option of not only generating one optimized plan for your LTCE run, but offering multiple optimized plans of different resource types, different resource selection years, et cetera. So initially, that's a hell of a lot of data. It can seem overwhelming. What do we actually do with that? So again, where I want to spend most of my remaining time is in those filter considerations. By taking and applying different filters, different things, both qualitatively and quantitatively that are important to your company, maybe important to your commission, important to your stakeholder groups, only then are you actually going to end up with that optimal resource plan for all parties that's going to get you to be able to file an IRP that your company is confident in, and maybe even file an IRP that can actually be settled with all parties before it gets through the full filing process. So what are those evaluation and application factors? Anybody in the room, is anyone currently using the additional plan option in Aurora? Wow, no one? I can say whatever I want and nobody can contradict me. Fantastic. All right. So again, when you use this plan, it's going to generate a lot of different additional data. And unless you know kind of what things to look for, again, that can just seem overwhelming. Now, there may be different factors than what we go through today that may be more important to your company. I'm going to focus on the 4 we really use and just touch on those really quickly. So some of the application factors we applied when we were looking at, again, 500 plans for 224 different cases in our IRP. One was the net present value. So again, net present value, net of value and cost. There's going to be some level of cost to portfolio for putting together these optimized plans over the course of your study period. What's interesting is as you look through, say, plan 1, 2, 3, and get down into potentially the 10s or the 20s or even the 50s, you start to see a significant potential shift in resources. So the example we're going to look at is you can move from a renewable heavy optimized plan to, say, a CC gas heavy optimized plan, but you might not actually see that big a difference in cost. And that's the example we'll look at in just a second. Second is what types of resources are selected. By generating additional plans, this is really where you can start to see trends in where certain resources are selected, how quickly they're selected, how frequently they're selected. A good example, again, is our demand-side resources. Our demand-side programs were selected consistently first in probably almost every single one of those 500 plans for those 224 cases. If you looked at trending, it's those demand-side programs that showed up most frequently and consistently. So as soon as we had those results, we were going back to those programs within our company and saying, hey, listen, these are showing up a ton. We're going to need these as much as possible. We need to really make sure that our input assumptions are correct for these programs because we are going to definitely need to include these in our proposed course of action. Timing of resource builds. And again, we can look at this example in just a second, too, with the example I have. Basically, again, when are certain resources getting built and how big? Something you can see in an optimized plan, but even generating 5 additional plans may give you additional data on, okay, if my plan loves solar, in plan 1 it wants it all in 1 year, but it's starting to spread out that build. That's useful information to me because what is the additional cost associated with that? And that spread out may cost more, but it might be much more feasible from a utility build perspective. And so now I immediately have that data point of how much it's going to cost in a plan that it might cost more, but at the same time be more practical. And finally, honestly, this was the biggest one for us, is number 4, resource and portfolio risk. Our senior team made a decision during our IRP process of what they called no big bets. They determined they did not want a big bet on a combined cycle plant. They determined that they really wanted that portfolio diversity was extremely important. Again, this actually happened during the IRP process, but that meant we had all these additional plans to go back and look at, information that was already generated within the model that we could go back and look at and figure out, okay, how often, how frequently, and at what level are those diverse plans showing up? If we did have our optimal plan being an 1100 megawatt CC unit, okay, that's probably not going to fit within our portfolio diversity now. All right, let's go back in. Are we finding that diverse portfolio in plan 2, or are we finding it in plan 250? That's a big difference. That's definitely a different conversation that we then need to have with the senior team to figure out, again, how we're going to meet a portfolio risk and portfolio diversity goal, while at the same time making sure that we are operating on our customers' behalf and making the least rate impact possible. All right, so let's look at an example. Oh my God, what are we looking at? I thought we were at an Aurora conference. All right, so again, I have to qualify we did use strategist for our 2018 IRP. That means I have to use a strategist example. I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible before I get booed off the stage for using strategist during an Aurora conference. All right, so as you can see, one of the initial advantages of Aurora is the user interface and how to actually interpret results. Ben and I were talking in the back. My undergrad degree is actually in animal science, which is basically livestock management. I joined the IRP team partway through our IRP, and this was one of the first meetings I attended, was looking at a screen like that. And I can tell you I almost ran back to the farm and rethought my career choices. So let's look at a little bit, though, of exactly how this works. So we're basically in one of our retirement scenarios. We're spitting out basically the optimal and suboptimal plans that strategist is generating for us. And again, Aurora has the same capability, and we're going to see in a few slides, you get the same results, just easier to interpret. So our optimal plan is listed there by the 1. And basically your resource choices for your study period are listed directly under that number 1. So in any years that there is a need within our study period, strategist is obviously selecting the most optimal resource from a cost perspective to meet that need, because strategist is a least cost model and a least cost model only. So that means our optimal plan, you can see this is a renewable heavy plan. In your outer years, which is where we were seeing the most need in our IRP, you're selecting some solar, some wind units, and again, demand side is being chosen upfront and very quickly. So the overall NPV of portfolio, again, net NPV of value and cost for this optimal plan is about $20.6 billion. And as a reference point, our annual company cost is approximately $1.7 billion, if you need a little bit of a reference point from a consumer's perspective. So that's our optimal plan. And then you basically walk down 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can see that as we walk down our suboptimal plans, different resource selections in different periods. Not a significant difference. I know this is a hard slide to see probably from in the back, but not a lot of difference. It's just selecting similar resources, but at slightly different periods. And again, basically in optimals and suboptimals for strategist, as you go up in cost, and your percentage cost difference is listed at the bottom. Now you can see the difference between plan 1 and 2 is only 0.01%. It's pretty negligible. And again, that's something we'd expect, basically, that our optimal and suboptimal, especially when we have about the same resource selections, are going to be about the same. So let's dive a little bit deeper. Now we're actually in that exact same case, but you can see by the numbers at the top that we are more in the teens. Basically, we're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. So we're in the low teens, the late teens, early 20s of our suboptimal plans for this same case. So remember, our first optimal plan was renewables heavy and had an NPV of $20.6 billion. What's interesting here is let's go back to those 4 evaluation factors we talked about. Our first one was significant resource change for a small change in NPV or cost. So if we now look at Plan 22 is selecting a combined cycle unit in our outer years, whereas our optimal plan was selecting solar. So again, our optimal plan, 2031, was our highest capacity need because we had 4 coal units retiring at defined end of useful life. So our optimal plan, renewables heavy, selected a lot of solar. By Plan 22, you're selecting a very large combined cycle unit to meet that need instead. What's interesting is that difference is only 0.13%. So your NPV of this portfolio is less than 0.5% different. And there is a significant difference in how a company would approach constructing, communicating, planning for a lot of solar versus an 1,100 megawatt or a very large combined cycle unit. So this is a great example of one. By generating these optimal and suboptimal plans, we had additional data about where we started to see our shift in resources, because across our different portfolios, most often renewables were getting chosen. But we did have cases where combined cycles were showing up relatively early and at not much of an additional cost. So now again, we need to go back and apply the qualitative factors that are important to our company, like portfolio risk and diversity, to this same case, and we have those data points readily available. Again, just a quick other example is the fact that even a CT, so again, in less than 20 plans for this retirement scenario, we're already making that shift from renewables to fossil fuels. So that was very interesting for us. Again, a lot of good information that we were able to use with stakeholders. Speaking to, so that kind of covered 1 and 4 of my evaluation factors. For this example, number 2 and 3, which was the types of resources selected in the timing. Well, for the timing, you can look at that solar. So that green arrow solar selection in 2031 represents 3,200 megawatts of solar that Strategist wants us to install in 1 year. Well, let's be honest, that's just not feasible. So we knew that wasn't feasible. Obviously, again, Strategist is just generating based off the numbers. But because of our suboptimals, we were able to dig farther into the suboptimals. We were able to start seeing at what point that started shifting out. So instead of, say, 3,200 megawatts, when did that start shifting out into saying, okay, well, now you maybe install this solar across a different variety of years? And again, at what additional cost? And that then helped us construct our proposed course of action, which does include a huge amount of solar, but does not include a huge amount of solar being built in 1 year, 2031. And finally, again, the types of resources selected. Just a quick note that our optimals and suboptimals provided great input when we met with our stakeholder groups. So stakeholder groups interested in batteries. We had a ton of data to provide to them about when batteries showed up, based on the assumptions, what years were they showing up, how frequently, which again, we were one of the companies highlighted in one of the slides earlier this week that says 450 megawatts of battery by 2040. Really, again, it was the suboptimals that helped kind of provide what that number was going to be and how it was going to be filed in our IRP. All right, enough with Strategist before I get, again, yanked off the stage. Again, this option is available in Aurora, and we believe it has some significant advantages over Strategist that we're really excited to use for our next IRP. To use the additional plan option in Aurora, this is in study options for long-term capacity expansion. A quick note, you do need to be using the MIP methodology, either maximize value or minimize cost for the additional plan option. So just a quick note, you do need to be using MIP, but once you do, they're either minimize cost or maximize value. Your additional plans is basically then available, and again, this is customizable. You can do it anywhere from 1 to 100, and it does not actually add a lot of significant runtime, which is fantastic. Now, once you choose this option and run it in your LTCE, there's 2 different places that you can see this information. One is in the RM tables, and again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because I do have to say again, Consumers is just finalizing our LTCE setup, training and testing. So again, you can see we have some examples of additional plans visualized here, but all of these plans you can see either say training and or test. So we're going to be looking at visual examples, not content examples from an Aurora perspective. But for in the RM tables, again, if you're using the additional plans option, your optimal plan is going to show up basically at the bottom of your grouping without parentheses. So if you guys look about 3/4 of the way down the page, you can see something that's basically MCV _ 2030 _ test _ 3. That's our optimal plan. But then you can see there's 5 plans above it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in parentheses. That's 5 additional optimized plans for this test run. And how Aurora does this is basically it comes to its optimal, then kicks that out. Okay, here's your optimized plan. It then puts a constraint in place so that grouping of resources in those years cannot be selected, then goes back and solves again, kicks out the next optimal, constrains that selection specifically, goes back and does it again, however many times you want. And so you end up with the same information that you would get, again, that we used in Strategist, but with some additional advantages. The other place to see this information is in the LT build report tables. This is personally my favorite. And so in the additional, again, basically what you see here is if you filter by iteration, your LT iteration 0 is going to be your final iteration. You can see we have LT iteration 0 of our final iteration, and we have plan numbers 0, 1, 2, 3. So we have our optimal, and then 3 suboptimal, or additional plans. So you can see plans 0 and 1 actually select renewables. So one nice option here is you can see both these are selecting wind and solar. They're both also under units built. You can note that there's actually are numbers less than 1. Aurora offers the partial build option, which is not an option we had in our 2018 IRP, which means that from consumers' perspective, we had to build a variety of different prototypes of different sizes for every resource type to make sure that we weren't screening out resources due to size because we had no partial build option. In my infinite wisdom, I realized after I submitted this presentation that I cut off the years built as well as the cost. So apparently that slide was made at the beginning of a cup of coffee, not the end. And so again, we'll use this as a visual example because it looks like plans 0 and 1 are the same, I realize. It's really a difference in terms of the in terms of the years built, which again, I was smart enough to cut off of my slide, as well as the cost of those portfolios. So that's really what you're gonna see. And I know I'm running a little bit short on time, so we'll just kind of click through and show again how you can highlight the different other additional plans. So really, at the end of the day, the important thing is that the additional plans option, it can provide great data for IRP modeling regardless of what you're using. But with Aurora, there are advantages in terms of the fact that partial build can make that more efficient, more quick, and more accurate. There is improved modeling logic for DSM and batteries in Aurora. I think we've learned that quite a bit. Energy Exemplar has done a ton of work here. We're excited to use that. And there also is an ease of evaluating our optimized plans across all sensitivities. So you may have noticed in one of our first slides, we have 84 new requirements that we are going to be required to look at as part of our 2021 IRP. One of those is running our optimized plans through every single sensitivity that we're going to run. And Aurora has much better capabilities to do this. It's a lot more plug and play, which we're really looking forward to. So we've spent a lot of time on data, we've spent a lot of time on examples. The important thing again is actually I'm going to close on the qualitative side. Additional plans can give you a lot of great information in your IRP about different choices at different costs at different times, but only by looking at the optimal plans and the additional plans and then combining those with what your company plans might be, portfolio risk and diversity, stakeholder input, work with your commission. Only by applying all three of those and putting that into the filter, only then are you going to really generate that resource plan that is going to be the best IRP for your company or the best IRP for your state, for your customers. As again, we believe at Consumers, we've created the best IRP for Michigan. Questions?
We do have a few.
Okay.
First question is, was there, do you, let's see, did I get this right? How do you measure renewable integration costs, or have you attempted to try to do that?
Measure renewable integration costs.
Mm-hmm. Or quantify them somehow.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it relates to a question I've been asked. We actually, I'll be honest, we haven't. We're working on it right now. We believe that's going to be much more of a focus of our 2021 IRP. Is really working on that a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, okay. Was there recognition or concern with the valuation accuracy of the intermittent renewable resources with the low duration curve sort of approach of strategies?
Yes, yeah, there was. And again, we have a very good relationship with our commission, which is fantastic. And that is, I will be honest, that's probably one of the reasons, significant reasons for switching to Aurora is exactly what was just mentioned. We're hoping to correct that moving forward.
There's a question about the filter criteria, and just wondering, could some of that filter criteria that you implemented, could that possibly be implemented upstream in the LT constraints in the first place, in your view, just so that you produce a smaller universe of data that needs to be considered carefully?
Yep, absolutely. That's a fantastic point, and that is something that we hope to do. So a good example is, our clean energy plan is 90% reduction in our portfolio emissions by 2040, I believe. That is something that can actually now, and we actually have, that's one of the final testing things that we're doing within Aurora right now, is actually just putting that in as constraints. So ideally, you do put as much as possible in as constraints or as assumptions or in the front end of Aurora, and then you don't necessarily need to do these same evaluation factors in the additional plans. For us, though, we still believe it's a valuable option, because especially with Aurora, it does not add much runtime, and it just gives you those extra data points that you might not otherwise have.
Yeah, okay, great. There's a question here about a scenario of no big bets. So did you measure the cost of the no big bets policy in your analysis, for example, comparing the cost of a portfolio with a combined cycle build to those without?
Can you repeat the second half of that? Because I think we did specifically look at that.
Yeah, okay. Just an example might be comparing the cost of a portfolio with a combined cycle build to one without, or just sort of we're not taking any huge risks on this one.
Right. No, absolutely. And actually we did, in our actual exhibits for our IRP, our optimal proposed course of action was that renewable heavy that I mentioned, but we actually also filed an alternate plan which did actually include that combined cycle. Because the NPVs were so close, we did actually file for both a proposed course of action and an alternate, and that alternate was actually with the combined cycle. Because actually with one combined cycle, we would actually still meet our clean energy plan goals. We were able to model that and determine with one combined cycle that we would actually still meet those goals.
Great. All right. Let's give Anna a round of applause. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Thanks.
Well done.
Thanks.
Yeah.